Somewhere inside your own computer right now, in a patch note you probably scrolled past without reading, the most powerful software company on the planet is quietly admitting defeat, and almost nobody is reading it the right way. Not hidden, not classified, just happening the quietest way, buried in update logs, government press releases, and hardware roadmaps most people scroll straight past, and that's exactly why it matters. Because the biggest shifts in technology history rarely arrive with a bang. They arrive exactly like this, silently, until one day you look up, and the entire landscape has already changed underneath you. What I'm talking about is the slow, almost humiliating unraveling of Windows, the operating system sitting on more than 1 billion machines, backed by one of the richest corporations ever to exist, now visibly struggling against an opponent its own executives spent 30 years publicly mocking. Not a flashy startup, not a foreign tech giant with a war chest of subsidies. Linux, the free operating system Microsoft, once compared to a cancer, the thing analysts dismissed for 2 decades as a hobbyist toy for basement programmers, is now sitting inside government ministries, national police forces, premium gaming handhelds, and a rapidly growing share of ordinary home computers around the world. And right now, in the middle of 2026, the evidence is stacking up faster than most people can process it. So let's start with the part Microsoft doesn't put on its keynote slides, because on July the 14th, Microsoft pushed out its biggest Windows 11 update of the summer, and buried inside it were features like point-in-time restore and pausable updates, tools built specifically to help you undo the damage the operating system does to itself. Sit with that. An operating system in its 5th year of release now needs its own dedicated recovery system just to survive its own update cycle. That isn't a feature, that's a confession. And it lands right on the heels of a genuinely brutal stretch of months, because just weeks earlier, Microsoft was forced to publicly confirm that a single June patch broke Office automation entirely, crashing Word, PowerPoint, and Excel across some of the most widely used business laptops on the planet, including multiple HP EliteBook and ProBook models sitting on real desks doing real work. Businesses reported boot failures, BitLocker recovery loops locking people out of their own files, and blue screens on brand new commercial hardware that had barely left the box. Weeks before that, users discovered a separate bug quietly consuming up to 500 gigabytes of storage inside a hidden system file. Windows itself refuses to let you open, a file most users didn't know existed until reporters forced Microsoft to acknowledge it. And if you rewind further, January of 2026 brought a wave of shutdown failures, cloud app crashes, and emergency out-of-band patches so severe that Microsoft's own president of Windows and Devices had to stand in front of reporters and admit, on the record, that user frustration had become impossible to ignore, promising that the entire year would be spent fixing reliability instead of shipping new features. Think about what that sentence actually costs Microsoft to say out loud. It means the flagship product, running on more than 1 billion devices, has become unstable enough that repairing it had to take priority over everything else planned for the year. That isn't a normal year for a technology giant. That is damage control. And while Microsoft has been quietly firefighting behind the scenes, something completely different has been building on the other side of the operating system world. And here the story turns genuinely stunning, because in March of 2026, Linux crossed 5.33% market share on the Steam gaming platform, according to Valve's own hardware survey, the highest number ever recorded in the platform's entire history. That number matters more than almost any other statistic in this story, because gaming was supposed to be the one fortress Windows would never lose. For 2 full decades, if you wanted to instantly shut down any conversation about switching operating systems, all you had to say was 2 words, my games, and that argument is dead now, and we're going to spend real time proving exactly why. But the growth here isn't confined to gaming alone, and it isn't some temporary blip either, because independent tracking from multiple research groups places global Linux desktop share at roughly 4.7% by the end of 2025, up from just 2.76% in the middle of 2022, which works out to growth of more than 70% in only 3 years. The United States crossed the symbolic 5% threshold for the very first time in June of 2025, according to StatCounter, becoming the first major Western market ever to hit that number. And analysts tracking the current trajectory are now projecting Linux could reach somewhere close to 6% of the entire global desktop market before the end of this year, a number that would have been laughed out of any serious technology conversation a decade ago. So here's the question I want you sitting with as we go deeper, because it's the exact question reportedly keeping people inside Microsoft awake at night right now. What happens when the operating system famous for being unbreakable, impossibly well-funded, and completely uncontested starts losing ground? Not because of one single catastrophic failure, but because of 1,000 small cracks appearing all at once. At the precise moment it's patient, 35 a Year-old rival finally has the hardware support, the gaming compatibility, and the government backing to walk straight through every single one of them. Because that is exactly what's unfolding right now in real time in the second half of 2026. And once you see the full picture, the hardware manufacturers quietly restructuring entire product lines around it, the government's writing it directly into national law, the sheer scale of what's actually coming, you'll understand exactly why this title isn't an exaggeration. Let's start with the hardware, because this is the piece even long time skeptics can no longer wave away. Just weeks ago, Lenovo confirmed that its Legion Go 2, one of the most anticipated gaming handhelds of the year, would ship with SteamOS as its default out-of-the-box operating system rather than Windows. A mainstream global manufacturer, one of the biggest PC makers on the planet, looked at real sales data and concluded shipping Linux instead of Windows was now the safer commercial bet, not the riskier one, because manufacturer roadmaps aren't built on wishful thinking. They're built years in advance on cold, hard purchasing data from departments that exist specifically to avoid expensive mistakes. And Lenovo isn't acting alone here either. Valve itself is preparing a new Steam Machine, a compact 4K capable Linux gaming PC designed to sit under your television and compete directly with dedicated consoles, and other manufacturers are already quietly lining up behind the Steam OS ecosystem Lenovo just validated in public. None of this would matter without the technology quietly making it possible, and that technology has a name most casual users have never heard, even though it might be the single most important piece of compatibility software built in the last decade. It's called Proton, Valve's translation layer that takes games built exclusively for Windows and lets them run on Linux without developers changing a single line of code. You buy the game, Proton handles the translation invisibly in the background. And as of Proton 9, more than 90% of Steam's top 1,000 games run with Platinum or Gold ratings, meaning they either work perfectly or with only cosmetic issues that never touch gameplay. ProtonDB, the independent community database tracking real compatibility across Steam's entire catalog, now counts roughly 106,000 of Steam's nearly 118,000 games as playable on Linux, including massive, technically demanding titles once considered the ultimate proof Linux could never keep up. Cyberpunk 2077, Elden Ring, Baldur's Gate 3, all running with performance that stands directly alongside native Windows. Installations on identical hardware. Proton 11, which entered public beta earlier this year, pushes even further, built on Wine 11 with NT-Sync kernel driver support that moves part of Windows' own synchronization model directly into the Linux kernel itself, cutting CPU overhead and smoothing out frame delivery across thousands of games at once, and it even introduces early ARM64 builds. A clear signal Valve isn't just fighting today's battle, it's already positioning itself for the next generation of gaming hardware entirely. The old question that defined Linux gaming for 2 decades, can it even run my games, has effectively been retired. The real question now is, what, if anything, a gamer would actually have to sacrifice to leave Windows behind completely? And for a growing slice of the gaming population, the honest answer is shrinking toward nothing. Layer the raw numbers on top of that hardware momentum, and the picture gets harder to dismiss. Steam's own hardware survey recorded that historic 5.33% Linux share back in March, before settling to around 4.5% in following months, still dramatically higher than anything recorded in the platform's history before the Steam Deck existed. Compare that to 2015, when Linux gaming on Steam couldn't crack 1%, and you see how compressed this timeline actually is. It took Linux roughly 2 decades to reach 1% of the desktop market in 2011, and another full decade to reach 2% in 2021, but the jump from there has been dramatically faster, the kind of curve that tends to show up right before something tips permanently. Underneath all of it sits AMD, whose open source driver commitment has made it the dominant chip maker among Linux gamers, powering roughly 74% of Linux Steam users compared to only 38% on Windows systems, a direct result of the custom AMD silicon inside the Steam Deck pulling an entire new wave of users into the ecosystem. This isn't only a gaming story anymore, and it isn't only a hardware story either, because underneath the surface, the actual operating system has quietly matured into something almost unrecognizable compared to the clunky, terminal-heavy Linux most people remember from a decade ago. The industry-wide shift from the aging X211 display system to Wayland, a transition the Linux community argued about for the better part of a decade, has now reached the point where every major distribution ships Wayland by default, bringing proper HDR support, variable refresh rate handling, and multi-monitor management that finally matches what Windows and Mac OS users have taken for granted for years. Installing a modern Linux distribution now takes 20 to 40 minutes on most current hardware with no product key to hunt down, no forced account creation, and no AI assistant inserting itself into every corner of the interface uninvited. So picture the full scene forming right now, a premium gaming handheld running Linux by default, a translation layer making virtually the entire Windows game library playable without developers lifting a finger, a kernel that keeps getting measurably faster with every release, and an installation process simple enough for someone who has never touched a terminal in their life. That's the consumer side of the story. And it's already enough to make Microsoft nervous, but it isn't even the most dangerous part of what's coming. Because while gamers and hardware manufacturers have been quietly rebuilding the desktop from the bottom up, an entirely different group has been making a far more permanent kind of decision. One measured not in gaming benchmarks, but in national budgets, legal mandates, and a single word that keeps showing up in nearly every government strategy document published this year: sovereignty. Roughly 2.5 million Windows workstations are now scheduled for migration across the French public sector. And this is not France experimenting blindly with untested software, because the French National Gendarmerie has already been running Linux since 2008, operating more than 100,000 workstations on a custom Ubuntu-based build known as Ubuntu, saving an estimated €2 million a year in licensing costs alone. That's an 18-year operational track record inside one of the largest law enforcement agencies in Europe. And it's precisely the evidence the rest of the French government now points to when justifying the same approach nationwide. And France is not acting alone. Germany's state of Schleswig-Holstein became the first region in Europe to fully replace Microsoft's software stack with Linux and open source alternatives across its public offices, a transition it completed back in 2024 and has continued expanding since. Denmark's Ministry of Digital Affairs launched its own formal transition away from Microsoft toward open source platforms, with rollout phases continuing through the back half of 2025 and into this year. And then there's Switzerland, which took things further than almost anyone else, passing legislation that legally requires any software developed using public funding to be released as open source code, backing that commitment with 231 million francs allocated specifically to build sovereign, nationally controlled cloud infrastructure. This isn't a country dabbling in open source out of curiosity. This is a national government writing open source requirements directly into law and putting real money behind digital independence. And there are even serious discussions in European policy circles now around a shared EU-wide Linux initiative for public administrations, a project that would have sounded fantastical a few years ago and is now taken seriously in Brussels. So ask yourself the obvious question: why is this happening now in this specific window of time, after decades of governments quietly tolerating Microsoft's dominance without much resistance? The answer keeps showing up in the same word over and over across every single one of these policy documents: sovereignty, digital sovereignty. The idea that a government's own computing infrastructure, the systems running its hospitals, its courts, its ministries, its police forces, should not be a closed black box controlled by a single foreign corporation, subject to that corporation's pricing. Decisions, its update schedules, and its data practices. Linux answers that question in a way no proprietary system ever can, because the source code is fully public, and any government, any independent auditor, any security researcher can read every single line of it, verify exactly what it does, confirm there's no hidden telemetry, and modify it to fit their own national requirements without waiting for permission from a corporate headquarters overseas. In a geopolitical climate where data control has become as strategically important as energy or defense, that kind of transparency isn't a nice to have anymore. It's becoming policy. And here's where the economic argument stacks directly on top of the sovereignty argument, because 2026 has been a brutal year for computer hardware. Pricing. DDR5 memory prices climbed over 170% year over year, GPU prices rose sharply, SSD costs increased across the board, and Windows 11's strict hardware requirements, which locked somewhere between 240 and 400 million perfectly functional computers out of eligibility, stopped being a minor annoyance and became a genuine financial barrier for hundreds of millions of ordinary people and cash-strapped institutions alike. Replacing a working computer just to satisfy an artificial software requirement can mean spending anywhere from 400 to well over €1,000 in a market where nearly every component has gotten more expensive at the same time. And meanwhile, staying on Windows 10 past its October 2025 end of support date means running a system with no more security patches, the vulnerability window widening every single week that passes. Linux sidesteps that entire dilemma. Independent testing has shown lightweight Linux distributions running noticeably faster on aging hardware than Windows 11 runs on brand new machines. with some benchmarks showing Linux outperforming Windows 11 by close to 20% on identical equipment. And for a finance ministry staring down a budget spreadsheet or a household watching a generation of usable computers get artificially declared obsolete, that math is impossible to ignore. Government adoption gives Linux something it has never had at this scale before: permanent, budgeted, legally binding institutional demand. The kind of demand that doesn't reverse itself easily, because once a national police force has run a system for 18 years and can quantify the savings, once a country has written open source requirements into its actual legal code, walking that back would require politicians to publicly justify handing sovereignty and savings back to a foreign corporation, a conversation almost no elected official wants to have in front of voters. So here's where that leaves Microsoft heading into the back half of 2026. It isn't losing the desktop war on a single front. It's losing ground simultaneously on the gaming front, where Proton and the Steam Deck ecosystem have quietly dismantled the last unbeatable argument for staying on Windows. It's losing ground on the government front, where entire national IT budgets are being legally redirected away from it. And it's losing ground on the everyday software front too: the browsers, the office suites, the creative tools, and the communication apps that used to be Windows' last unshakable fortress. Because the truth is, the list of things you'd actually have to give up by leaving Windows behind has gotten shorter than almost anyone in the industry is willing to admit publicly. And once you see exactly how short that list has become, the entire picture of what's happening in 2026 snaps into focus. For 2 decades, the single most convincing reason to stay on Windows had nothing to do with government policy or gaming benchmarks. It was software. Simple, everyday software. The argument used to be airtight. Sure, Linux is free and fast, but the programs you actually need every day just don't exist there. That argument has been quietly eroding piece by piece. And by the middle of 2026, most of it has simply collapsed. The browser argument disappeared first. Chrome, Firefox, and Brave all run on Linux with complete feature parity to their Windows versions. No compromises, no missing extensions. Then the productivity argument followed. LibreOffice now handles Microsoft Office file formats well enough that opening, editing, and exchanging Word and Excel documents with colleagues still on Windows causes barely a hiccup for the overwhelming majority of everyday users. Then came communication and entertainment. Spotify, Discord, Telegram, Zoom, and Slack all maintain fully supported, officially built native Linux clients today. Not third-party workarounds, but real applications, built and maintained by the companies themselves. Even professional creative work, the space people assumed would stay locked to Windows and macOS forever, has shifted. DaVinci Resolve, used in major film and television productions worldwide, has run natively on Linux for years, and tools like Krita and Inkscape have matured into genuinely capable applications that working designers now use as primary tools rather than backup options. And then there's gaming, the very last fortress, the argument that used to end every single one of these debates without any possibility of rebuttal. And as we covered earlier, that wall is fracturing under the combined weight of Proton, the Steam Deck ecosystem, Lenovo's Legion Go 2 running Steam OS by default, Valve's upcoming Steam machine, and a native and compatible Linux game library that now includes well over 100,000 titles playable through Proton alone. Add up every one of these: shifts, browsers, office tools, communication apps, creative software, and gaming, and you get something that would have sounded like fantasy even 5 years ago. An ordinary person switching to Linux today gives up almost nothing they use on a daily basis. None of this happens in isolation. It's connected to something bigger happening underneath the entire tech industry, because Linux doesn't just power a growing slice of desktops, it powers almost the entire infrastructure the modern world runs on. All 500 of the most powerful supercomputers on the planet run Linux, a streak unbroken since November 2017. Roughly half of all server operating systems worldwide, by some measures more, run on Linux today, and it powers well over 3/4 of identifiable web servers. Every major cloud platform, Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, and Microsoft's own Azure, runs the overwhelming majority of its workloads on Linux, including, ironically, much of the infrastructure Microsoft itself depends on to sell its cloud services, and the artificial intelligence systems reshaping the entire economy. Right now, the models writing code, generating images, powering recommendation engines are almost universally trained and deployed on Linux infrastructure. And developers, the people deciding what gets built and which platforms get prioritized, are already living on Linux in disproportionate numbers. Recent survey data shows Ubuntu alone used by more than 1/4 of professional developers for personal computing, with total Linux usage among developers running far higher than its desktop numbers suggest. And that matters, because when developers prefer a platform, they build for it more naturally and advocate for it inside their own companies without anyone asking. That's a compounding advantage that doesn't show up cleanly on any single market share chart, but it quietly reshapes an entire industry over time. Here's the honest, balanced part of the story, because exaggerating it would do you no favors. Windows is not dying tomorrow. It still commands somewhere around 60 to 70% of the global desktop market, and for specific professional workflows and specialized engineering tools with no direct Linux equivalent, Windows remains genuinely necessary for a lot of people. That isn't going to change overnight, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling a fantasy, not a forecast. But that was never really the question that mattered. The real question was always whether Linux had crossed the threshold from being a niche alternative that experts recommend and ordinary people ignore into something with genuine, structural, self-reinforcing momentum behind it. And by every metric we've walked through, gaming share climbing to record highs since the Steam Deck's launch, major manufacturers shipping Linux by default on premium hardware, national governments writing open source mandates directly into law, and Windows 11 itself lurching from one embarrassing bug to another throughout 2026 while its own executives publicly admit the backlash is real, that threshold has now been crossed. Analysts are currently projecting Linux could approach 6% of the global desktop market before the end of this year, a number that would have been dismissed as wishful thinking just 3 years ago and now looks, if anything, conservative. So here's what I want to leave you with. Windows isn't losing because of one dramatic failure. It's losing the way every long dominant giant eventually starts losing, through 1,000 small cracks appearing all at once, right as its patient, 35-year-old rival finally has the hardware, the software, the government backing, and the momentum to walk straight through every one of them. That isn't speculation. That's the story unfolding right now, in July of 2026. The story the industry has been quietly avoiding until it became the only story left to tell. If this breakdown opened your eyes to something you hadn't connected before, tell me in the comments which part surprised you the most. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next in this story, and share this with the one person in your life who still insists Linux could never be ready. Because right now, in 2026, it already is.